You ordered the killing of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children. Gas chambers, mass shootings, death marches through frozen Europe. So I am going to ask you the question the entire world wants answered. Why did you do it?
Because I believed the survival of the German race depended on it. You can call that evil. I called it duty.
Duty. You used that word to describe the murder of millions. Who were you before any of this started?
I was nobody. Born in Braunau am Inn, Austria on April 20th, 1889. My father, Alois, was a customs official who beat me on a regular basis and demanded I follow him into government work. I hated that man to the marrow of my bones. Every conversation was a command. Every disagreement ended with his fists. My mother, Clara, was the only person who ever loved me without conditions. She was gentle, warm, and completely devoted to her children. She would sit beside me for hours while drew buildings and churches in my sketchbooks. She was the only human being who ever made me feel like I deserved to exist. When she died of breast cancer in December of 1907, the Jewish physician who treated her told me he had never seen a son grieve so deeply. I held her hand while she took her last breath, and something inside me died in that room alongside her. The boy who walked in holding his mother's hand and the young man who walked out alone were two completely different human beings. Something disappeared from inside me that night, and it never came back.
What happened after she died?
I moved to Vienna chasing the dream of becoming a painter. The Academy of Fine Arts rejected me twice without a word of explanation. Within months, I was sleeping in homeless shelters, selling cheap postcards on frozen street corners just to afford a single meal. I was starving, humiliated, and consumed by rage at the entire world around me. But Vienna gave me something far more dangerous than any art education. Vienna taught me how to hate with purpose. I watched Jewish intellectuals and businessmen thrive in that city while I rotted in shelters with holes in my shoes. The newspapers were run by Jewish editors. The banks were controlled by Jewish financiers. The theaters and universities belonged to them while I could not afford bread. And a fury took root inside me during those years that I need you to understand something about. That fury burned from those gutters all the way to the bunker where I put a bullet through my own skull. It never went out. Not for one day.
So you blamed an entire race for your own failures.
Call it whatever allows you to sleep at night. I called it clarity, and I carried that clarity into the most brutal education any man could receive.
What education?
War. I volunteered for the German army in August of 1914 and served 4 brutal years on the Western Front. Gunfire, artillery, trench warfare, gas attacks. A Western F British mustard gas shell blinded me temporarily in October of 1918. But the war gave me the first sense of belonging I had ever experienced in my miserable existence. And when Germany surrendered 1 month later, I was lying in a field hospital with bandages over my eyes when a pastor walked in and told us the war was lost. I collapsed into my pillow and wept with a rage so deep it burned the grief right out of my body. I swore on that hospital bed that the politicians who signed that surrender would pay for what they had done to our nation.
What happened to Germany after the surrender?
The Treaty of Versailles gutted our nation. The Allies stripped away German territory, crushed our economy under billions in reparations, and forced 70 million people to accept sole blame for a war that killed soldiers on all sides. Inflation destroyed the currency until a single loaf of bread cost billions of marks. Families burned paper money for warmth because it held less value than firewood. Children starved in the streets while politicians debated behind closed doors. And into that suffering, into that national humiliation, I walked with one message that changed the course of human history.
What message?
That Germany had been stabbed in the back by traitors from within, by communists, by Jewish conspirators, by cowardly politicians who sold our dignity at Versailles for the illusion of peace. I said what 70 million people already felt burning in their stomachs, but were too afraid to speak out loud. And they did not just agree with me, they worshipped me. They screamed my name in stadiums that held 200,000 bodies. Mothers held their children above the crowd so they could see my face. I gave rallies that lasted 3 hours and not a single person left. Grown men who had fought in the trenches stood at attention with tears running down their faces because I had given them back the one thing the treaty had stolen: pride. By January 1933, I was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Within 18 months, I crushed every political party, murdered my rivals during the Night of the Long Knives, and seized total control. Absolute power over an entire nation with no elections, no opposition, and no one left alive who dared to challenge me.
How did people react to your power?
They celebrated with tears streaming down their faces. They marched through Berlin carrying torches in my honor. They did not need convincing of anything. They needed someone to give them permission to feel what they already felt. And I gave it to them with both hands open.
What did you do with that power before the war?
The Nuremberg laws of 1935 stripped Jewish citizens of their nationality, their right to vote, their right to marry non-Jewish Germans, their right to work as doctors, lawyers, or teachers. Jewish children were thrown out of public schools. Jewish businesses were boycotted and vandalized, and the rest of Germany did not resist. They moved into the homes their neighbors were forced to abandon. They took the jobs. They accepted it all without question because I had spent years convincing them that Jewish people were not fully human. Then came Kristallnacht, November 9th, 1938. My forces shattered the windows of over 7,500 Jewish businesses across Germany and Austria in a single night. They burned more than 1,000 synagogues to the ground, while firefighters stood nearby with orders to protect only the adjacent non-Jewish buildings and let the temples burn. They dragged Jewish families into the streets in their nightclothes and beat them with fists and clubs while their neighbors watched from behind drawn curtains. Some of those neighbors cheered. Children watched their parents beaten bloody on the pavement outside their own front doors. 91 people were killed. 30,000 were arrested and sent to concentration camps. The streets were covered in so much broken glass the next morning that it looked like the entire country had been hit by a crystal storm. And the international response was written statements of concern and absolutely nothing else.
The world watched and did nothing.
They had years to stop me. They chose not to. The British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich in September of 1938 and handed me the Sudetenland on a silver platter in exchange for a piece of paper promising peace. I shook his hand and laughed about it later with my inner circle. He believed he was negotiating with a rational leader. He was negotiating with a man who had already decided that war was the only path forward, and the only question left was timing.
September 1st, 1939.
1.5 million soldiers, over 2,000 tanks, and nearly 900 bombers crossed the Polish border at dawn. The British had spent years appeasing my demands. They handed me the Sudetenland at Munich and begged me to stop. I was never going to stop. Poland surrendered in 5 weeks. Denmark fell in a single day. Norway in 2 months. Belgium and the Netherlands in 18 days. France, the nation that humiliated us at Versailles, collapsed in 6 weeks. My army marched through the Arc de Triomphe while French citizens wept on the sidewalks. By the summer of 1940, I controlled more of Europe than any conqueror in history. And then I turned to the real objective.
The extermination.
When we invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, I deployed mobile killing squads called Einsatzgruppen directly behind the advancing army. Their orders were absolute. Round up every Jewish man, woman, child, and infant in occupied territory. March them to forests and open ravines outside their own towns. Force them to strip naked and stand at the edge of mass graves they had dug with their own bare hands. And shoot them in waves, row after row, until the pit was full of bodies stacked 3 and 4 layers deep. At Babi Yar outside Kiev, my forces executed 33,700 people in 48 hours. They lined them up at the edge of a gorge and fired from dawn until dark without stopping. Mothers were shot holding their babies against their chests. The bodies fell on top of each other until they filled the ravine completely. Then my soldiers covered the remains with a thin layer of dirt and moved on to the next town, as though nothing had happened.
How many died in the shootings?
Over 1.5 million. And I decided that was too slow. The shootings were destroying my soldiers psychologically. Officers reported that men were drinking themselves unconscious every night, trying to erase the images of children falling into those pits. Several officers took their own lives. So I needed a method that removed the human element entirely. Something industrial. Something where the men operating the machinery never had to look at the faces of the people they were killing. We built 6 extermination centers across occupied Poland: Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chełmno, Majdanek.
Tell me what happened inside those camps.
Jewish families across Europe received orders to report to collection points. They were told they were being resettled to work camps in the east. They packed photographs, medicines, prayer books, toys for their children. They were loaded into cattle cars, sometimes 150 people crushed into a single boxcar with no food, no water, and a single bucket for sanitation. The trains traveled for days. Some people died standing up because there was no room to fall down. When the doors finally opened at the camps, the first thing that hit them was the smell. Burning human flesh from the crematoria that operated around the clock. SS officers separated arrivals into 2 lines. Those who could still perform hard labor went into the camp to be worked until they dropped dead from exhaustion, starvation, or disease. Everyone else went directly to the gas chambers. The elderly, the sick, pregnant women, mothers holding young children, anyone too weak to generate value for the Reich.
They thought they were getting showers.
Signs on the walls told them to remember the hook number where they hung their clothes so they could collect them afterward. Guards told mothers to hold their children's hands so nobody would get separated. Then they walked into sealed concrete rooms with fake shower heads bolted to the ceilings and heavy steel doors that locked from the outside. SS personnel standing on the roof dropped pellets of Zyklon B, a cyanide-based pesticide, through vents in the ceiling. The gas rose from the floor upward. The people nearest the ground died first. The strongest climbed over weaker bodies trying to reach breathable air near the ceiling. Parents lifted children above their heads. When the doors were opened 20 to 30 minutes later, the bodies inside were fused together in a single tangled mass. Skin discolored from the cyanide, fingernails shattered from clawing at the concrete walls. Forced labor squads dragged the bodies out, tore gold teeth from the mouths of the dead with pliers, shaved hair from their skulls for textile production, and loaded the remains into industrial crematoria that burned continuously without ever shutting down. At peak capacity in 1944, Auschwitz alone was gassing and burning over 6,000 human beings in a single 24-hour period.
Total body count.
A.
Stalingrad.
300,000 of my soldiers entered that city. 5 months of combat so savage that men fought room to room, floor to floor, with knives, bayonets, and bare hands, in temperatures 40 degrees below zero. Soldiers froze to death standing upright at their posts. They ate horses first, then rats, then boiled the leather from their own boots and drank the broth. The wounded lay in frozen cellars screaming for morphine that did not exist anymore. Doctors performed amputations without anesthesia on operating tables made from doors ripped off their hinges. Soviet Marshal Zhukov assembled over 1 million troops and surrounded my entire army in a ring of steel and artillery. General Paulus radioed me, begging for permission to retreat, a retreat that would have saved 200,000 German lives. I denied him. He begged again. I denied him again. Paulus surrendered with 91,000 walking skeletons. Most of them would die in Soviet prison camps without ever seeing Germany again. My army never advanced a single step forward after that defeat.
Then D-Day. And then your own officers tried to kill you.
Colonel Stauffenberg placed a bomb under my conference table during the military briefing. The explosion killed 4 men beside me. I survived by pure chance, and I had 5,000 people connected to that conspiracy hunted down and executed. Some were hanged with piano wire from meat hooks. The killings were filmed so I could watch them afterward.
Describe the end.
The bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery had concrete walls 16 feet thick, and you could still feel the Soviet shells through the floor. The vibrations never stopped. Day and night, the building above me shook and crumbled while I paced underground corridors surrounded by generals who no longer believed a word I said. Berlin was unrecognizable. Buildings I once paraded past in triumph were reduced to flaming rubble and ash. Boys as young as 12 were being handed rifles and anti-tank weapons and pushed into the streets to fight Soviet armor rolling through their own neighborhoods. Most of them died within hours of being deployed, and I approved each and every one of those deployments without a second of hesitation or a shred of remorse. My generals begged me to flee south to the Alps and continue the fight from the mountains. I refused to leave that concrete tomb. On April 29th, I married Eva Braun 50 feet underground in a ceremony that lasted less than 10 minutes. She had followed me into that bunker when she could have escaped months earlier. She stayed when everyone else ran. The next afternoon, April 30th, 1945, we sat together on the sofa in my private study. Eva bit down on a cyanide capsule. I placed the barrel of my Walther pistol against my right temple and pulled the trigger. My staff wrapped our bodies in blankets, carried them up the stairs into the Chancellery garden, doused the remains in 200 liters of gasoline, and set the fire while Soviet shells exploded less than 300 meters away. 7 days later, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war I started had killed between 60 and 80 million people across the globe.
You denied 6 million families the justice of hearing you say the words, "I was wrong." You denied grieving mothers the right to ask you face to face why you gassed their children in concrete rooms disguised as showers. But I am not ending this by talking to you. I am talking to them. Everything you just heard required thousands of ordinary people to carry out. Engineers who designed the gas chambers and calculated the square footage needed to kill the maximum number of bodies per hour. Train conductors who drove the cattle cars. Clerks who stamped the paperwork. Neighbours who watched families dragged from their homes at gunpoint and chose silence because speaking up felt dangerous. That is how this happens. Not with one monster. With 1 million ordinary people who decided looking away was easier than standing up.